Hi everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Christina and I'm the events coordinator here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out some logistics for how tonight's going to go. We'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so start thinking of questions to ask now. After the talk tonight, Matt will be signing and personalizing books at the desk near where you checked in. We also have additional books available to purchase from my colleague at the register. If you're joining us virtually on the live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Invisible Things online using the link in the live stream description. It's my pleasure to celebrate the paperback release tonight of Invisible Things, a sharp allegorical novel about a hidden human civilization, a crucial election, and a mysterious invisible force that must not be named by one of our most imaginative comic novelists. Matt Johnson is a Philip H. Knight Chair of the Humanities at the University of Oregon. His publications include the novels Loving Day and Pym, and his work stretches into nonfiction and comic genres as well. Johnson is the recipient of the American Book Award and the United States Artist James Baldwin Fellowship, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature. As I mentioned earlier, Matt will be joined in conversation tonight with Victor LaValle. Victor LaValle is the author of 7 works of fiction, including The Changeling, The Ballad of Black Tom, and Lone Women. His novels have been included in Best of the Year lists by countless publications, and he's been awarded an impressive number of fellowships and awards. He lives in the Bronx with his wife and kids and teaches at Columbia University. Let's all give a very warm welcome to Matt and Victor.
One more round for Matt.
This he's decided he's going to embarrass me some way. I'm getting it out early. Thank you all for coming. I was really happy to read here. I've read a couple times in New York at universities, but I haven't read in person in a long time. And I had one, during this whole weird era, I had one reading, and of course I got COVID for the first time 3 days before I was supposed to do a book reading. So I feel like this has to be done to make it official. All right, so I'm going to read it for about 5 minutes, and then Vic's going to come up and try and embarrass me. Okay. This is from the second chapter, but I don't think you need to know anything before. It was freaking aliens, Chase declared, and then sipped his pistol's peat to give all the new faces at the meetup a chance to soak in that wisdom. Near Valos Caldera, about 60 miles west of Santa Fe. That's right. I said it. I got no problem saying it. Now, does that statement make me look crazy? Sure. But that doesn't mean freaking aliens didn't steal my wife. That was when the chili cheese tater tots came out of the kitchen. Carnitas, the waitress asked, and Chase reached up like she might drop the plate. There was a lot of, quote, unexplained phenomena, unquote, interest gatherings in New Mexico, and Chase was a regular at most of them, but the Allies of Alien Abduction Sunday night meetings at Tres Abuelitas was the gold standard. They had those private dining rooms, they had those pitchers of bud for $5. They turned tater tots into an art, just bucks more, and you could put meat on top, and it was a meal you could sleep on. There were a lot of UFO meetups to choose from. Some were strictly on that military UAP stuff, all the verified footage of the little tic-tac shapes or the long cigar-shaped ones, or the silent black triangles, or all that, each flying around at speeds and slants that would turn human passengers into applesauce. Lots of veterans of nuclear sites came as guest speakers to those clubs, coming to talk about the wild things they saw, trying to get the feds to disclose more. Some groups were all about that consciousness idea that you could communicate with the visitors if you meditated the right way. Other cliques were into the thing as a larger phenomenon, looking at portals and dimensions and poltergeists and whatnot, freaky stuff that freaked Chase out, even to think about. But of course, there was the old school ufology scene, with a whole mythology laying out the multiple alien species and a galactic tournament in which Earth was just one playing field. The meetings weren't just good. The meetings were important. Sometimes it was years between leaks of any solid data. So if you were interested in the topic, the best you could do was talk to like-minded others about what little you all knew. In short, there were tons of UAP podcasts featuring UAP podcasters talking to other UAP podcasters, but it was always better to commune in person, looking one another in the eye while destroying a steaming pile of chili cheese tater tots. But for the abductee experiencers, sweet Lord, that was a unique social situation. It was just different. All those believer camps, as varied and contentious as the members could be with one another, had one thing in common. Once you started talking about abductions, everyone got real uncomfortable real quick. All of a sudden, everyone was looking at you funny, like you were either crazy or crazy for bringing it up. A uniformed 4-star general could interrupt a sincere discussion about dogmen versus hybrid dinosaur pigs and reveal his abductee story, and everyone would look at him like he just crapped his pants. It was not a huge leap, at least not for Chase, to go from believing there were alien craft flying around to believing they might pick somebody up. The UFO scene had all types of people with all types of beliefs, but once you told them you were an experiencer of abduction, a lot of them figured that you were either nuts or a con artist, or they did believe you. And it made them majorly uncomfortable because it went against their pet theories, or simply because the idea that there were forces above that could snatch your ass whenever they wanted, do whatever they wanted, then make you forget if they wanted. That was some seriously fucked up shit. But not at Trace, I believe. Always a nice crowd at the Allies of Alien Abductees meetup, and always all types of folk, people willing to open their minds, and professional types, not just the kooks. Sometimes actual scientists would show up, or tourists who flew into Albuquerque before driving north to Santa Fe. But tonight was special because for the first time, Chase's boss, Harry Bremner, was finally in attendance. After a decade of declined invitation, here the old guy was, coming out to see what Albuquerque's unidentified phenomena scene was really all about. Having the boss in attendance, it was mind-blowing. That's the only way Chase could describe it. Such an honor. Harry Bremner was considered the Michelangelo of the military training compound industry. Getting him there was a huge accomplishment on Chase's part, a vindication of all those times he tried to get the old man engaged in a conversation on unidentified aerial phenomena and bombed. All those attempts that Harry shot down with, Chase, don't start with that shit again. After each failure, Chase accepted the brush off, waited a few months, then once again rolled down the limo's privacy window to tempt Harry with his latest theories and research on the UAP issue. It was Chase's duty to the cause, he felt. The issue could use the addition of Harry and his strategic megamind, his military experience and all that, his connections. But even Ada was like, Chase, if you don't cut it out, he's going to fire you. Or she'd say, nobody wants a chauffeur who won't shut up about freaking aliens. All right, thank you. That's just a time.
So hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here to ask these questions. I have a serious question about like the book and its themes, but because you read the alien part, I actually want to start with the alien part because I remember when you called me up and said, "Yo, they proved that there's aliens."
I did not say that.
You said
that's what I'm talking about, man.
That there might be aliens.
They proved that there's shit flying around.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like UFOs, aliens, abductees as seemingly like one of the last groups you can sort of freely make fun of.
Okay, so that's a good question. That's the thing. It's like when I first started the book, it was the summer of 2017, and I did not realize that in a couple months, the New York Times was going to have an article about Navy spottings of aerial phenomenon that we call UAPs right now. And so when I started, it was completely like metaphor. It wasn't like in the real space. And so when that happened, you know, and I read that article, like a lot of people, I was waiting for the logical disclaimer thing to come afterwards and say, well, you know, actually it's this, or actually, you know, it's a setup or whatever. And it never came. And so when it never came, I started like listening and doing research, basically for the book, but you know, simultaneously it went from this thing that was kind of a joke to something that was not. And everything in that thing that I read is like from that world.
Right.
And I'm fascinated by that world. I have no answers about anything, but nobody else there really does either. But everyone has all these theories, and they're very passionate about them. And sometimes they're contradictory theories. And, you know, the thing about the dinosaur, you know, like the dinosaur pig dogs, like that's like a real, like, event that, you know, you get stories like that. And at the same time, in part because of the era that the abductee stories came out of, there's a different kind of stigma to that point. And so, like, within all these little subcategories, that group was always still a little more stigmatized, even while some of the biggest instances that all of them agree, like all the different camps agree were big instances that should be looked at, include one like Benny and Barney Hill. I think they were NAACP workers who had the first kind of recorded modern abduction. And actually, I think the Obamas are doing a fictionalizing it for Netflix. But even the Obamas are getting canceled nowadays, so I don't know if they got it through. But yeah, so it was really a fascinating world, and actually the impulse then was to not just, you know, casually make fun of it. And so part of the fun here was like having this thing where this guy's a comic character, and you know, it's a comic world, but ultimately he's right.
He's right. That's what I was gonna say. Is like the big twist of it is everything is accurate, you know. Or if not everything.
Well, not his exact theory.
Exactly, not the pig men. But the idea.
There's something, yeah.
There was something there, and then that becomes the sort of passageway into this larger conversation about, among other things, mass denialism, right? And I wondered, like, even when the book came out, I wondered about this idea of like, how do you write about a thing that is running away from the culture, even as the book is published? You know what I mean? Like, even when the book came out, the limits of what might be considered, no one will buy that, no one would do that, no one would say that,
Right.
had already passed.
Yeah.
Right? Like the threshold keeps getting broken, like the sound barrier.
Yeah. I was looking at somebody, you know how now people retweet Trump's Truth Social posts on Twitter. And I was reading one today. Apparently, every once in a while, some go through. Everybody agrees they're real, and then it turns out they're not real. And sometimes even stranger ones go around. People think this can't possibly be real, and it's actually real. You can't satirize that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's impossible to do that because satire depends on ratcheting up a situation to its wildest extreme. And the wildest extreme, in most cases, is one of the wildest extremes you can get to is the lack of self-preservation. And so, like, you know, the early denialism of COVID is a great example, but like the early denialism of COVID earlier would have been a metaphor for how people deal with climate change or with race, or, you know, but because the extreme point was like, well, they wouldn't do that if their very lives were on the line. They would back up. But no, like Herman Cain was quite fine to pretend anything wasn't happening. You know what I mean? Like
Still tweeting after he died.
exactly. Yeah, you can't satirize.
Yeah, I don't know how you beat that.
Yeah, so like in some ways, like, you know, the American satirical tradition is very strong in two cases. One is war, and the other is race. And, you know, so you have Catch-22, you have Invisible Man, but that, like, there's other types of satire, but that's the strongest two places. And the reason is because even talking about them with a straight face, it involves absurdity. So, like, so going in with the angle of absurd allows you to get to some real truth. So, you know, with this one, most of the early drafts were done before COVID. And a lot of the major things were done before COVID. So it was kind of weird when like things started happening like that denialism and like, you know, the BLM protests uprising, a bunch of things were things that I had kind of done in the book. So like my first thought is like, I'm screwed. Like, you know, like you guys, like you're ruining the plot right now. But it was fascinating. And part of the reason I wanted to do that was because I write about climate in the past. I write about race, or particularly negotiating white supremacy. And like what I've noticed is the way that people deal with them is often the same. So the very earliest concept was what if I try and deal with the way the human brain is dealing with these issues as opposed to the specifics of the issues, which people get caught up on. So yeah, that was the experiment with this one.
Well, going as far back, let's go back, say, even to, say, Pym, or Loving Day. Pym being an academic satire as well as a satire about race. Like, I do wonder, as a satirist, how or when you almost decide on what you are going to wrestle with, right? Like, how, I just feel like it's an interesting narrative, like how you ended up on Pym.
Yeah.
Because I remember personally, like, one thing I remember is you called me up and saying Edgar Allan Poe wrote one novel and it's a piece of shit.
Paraphrasing, but yes.
No, I think that's actually what you said.
I might have.
And then a couple years later, Pym existed. And so...
See, this is why we don't do this together.
But you weren't wrong about that book.
No.
It's not a good book, right?
No, it's a great book and also not a good book.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so how does that then... So
Well, Pym was really probably when I die, Pym will be the book that people still, say they love or hate, But like one of the big things with Pym was that when because at that point I had a novel for a really long time. I had a lot of family stuff going on. I've been writing comic books and other things. So it'd been a while. I think it'd been almost 9 years since I had a novel. So when it came out, it got like the first thing that happened was like a big thing that was like not usual for my career before that was I got like the book of the month or something for Publishers Weekly, whatever they called it. And the review said it was really like talked about like it's a really funny book. And they're like in the review it was like, no, it's really funny. Not like it's funny, but like it's really funny. And I honestly read that and I got offended. Because I was like, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. There's nothing funny in this book. And I was like, man, well, okay, there's this one scene, there's this DNA test scene, which was funny. But I couldn't think of any other funny thing in the whole book. And so I had to go back and read it. And when I read it, I was like, oh my God. Because what happens is you write in these segments. So I would write 2 or 3 pages, maybe 5 pages in a day. And at some point, I would have a bit of humor in there, in part because that's just my language. And also just to like keep myself awake, like at the typewriter, but then you realize you add those together and all of a sudden you have hundreds and hundreds of these little kind of humorous moments that you didn't intend. And that was a real eye opener for like figuring out what it is that you do, in the first place.
I sort of buy what you're saying, but also like in the story, like in the original and in the Matt's novel, essentially an expedition makes it to Antarctica and they discover this race of giant, essentially Snow White, demi-humans or something. And right from the beginning, your characters call them ice honkies. So I just feel like you knew it was funny, really from the start.
Yes and no, though, because like...
That was serious.
I'm serious because like, in my head, there's like 5 people.
Snow honkies.
One of those.
Yes.
It could have been both. But in my head, there's like 5 people that I know will get the joke.
Right.
And I know you'll think it's funny.
I was laughing a lot.
Yeah, I know you'll think it's funny. And I see my editor back there. I know my editor, I'm thinking Chris will think this is funny.
Right.
But like, everybody else, I'm thinking they're just kind of, it'll just be background ambiance, And sometimes it is like it's not. Because when I'm doing that, I'm being absurd. Sometimes people don't take things as being absurd. Like, you really have to explain to them, you're allowed to laugh here. You're allowed to take this as absurdity. So, yeah, I did and I didn't. Like, I thought I was winking and I was actually using a bullhorn.
Right.
That's what it is. But the other part of it, too, and this took me even later to figure this part out, was that I tend to think of the book later as being about what was the hardest thing to do in the book. Not what is the greatest takeaway from somebody else reading, but like the biggest things that were tricky in the book were not the humor. The humor is like easy, like how long does it take to come up with snow honkies? You know what I mean? Like nothing, right? So, but then you like think about, okay, I'm trying to match exactly in parts how Poe did this or that, and I'm trying to have these interstitial events with a slave narrative based on a character in a Poe book, and that's also based on my own scholarly stuff with slave narratives. So I'm thinking about all these really complex things. So that stuff is really kind of low-hanging fruit. But when you do it right, nobody notices the complex parts. They just think that's the same as everything else. But again, it's something I don't know my own work in some ways. Like I'm continuing to kind of figure out what I actually do.
Well, you bring up there's an interesting thing you said there toward the end, which was this idea of like how do you give people permission to laugh, right? Like one of the hardest things out of reading is you read a part that has humor in it, but people think you're not supposed to laugh at a reading, so therefore they just neg you and you feel like you didn't write something funny. And it's even more difficult, I think, to pull off when it's just the book, because now they don't even have you there to sort of teach them. It's okay, I'm smiling, I'm this and that. So I wonder for you, when you're working on stuff, how do you think of yourself giving, because humor is such a central part of every book you've written.
Right. I mean, I think the hope you have, like, there's a lot of faith that you have to have as a writer, right? You have to have faith that you're actually going to finish the book. And you have to have faith that, you have enough talent to do it well, and all these things. Well, one of the faiths I have to have is that, hopefully the book will work on, there's somebody who is utterly humorless who will read the book and connect it at some level. Like, that's my hope. That's not necessarily the case, but that's my hope. So what I'm hoping for, I think it's impossible to imagine that everyone's going to take things the same way, because, unlike even TV, like, so much of the tone is dependent on the reader's own internal knowledge of literature, the internal experiences, all those things to make it something funny. So, like, I'm hoping then that you don't have to have my exact, like, chemical trauma makeup to get the book. You know what I mean? That, like, there's something else in there that's going to click with you. So there's going to be some layer or filter for everybody doing it. And, like, and people do read books in dramatically different ways. So I know that does happen sometimes. But I think, it's a faith-based endeavor, really.
Well, so then what was the hardest thing to write for Invisible Things? Or what was the hardest thing for you in Invisible Things?
The hardest thing was writing a satire about a culture that is basically in a satiric moment. Like, you couldn't come up with a president more absurd than Trump. I mean, like, when you look at, like, our absurd comedy, like, versions of a president, like Idiocracy and stuff like that, it's not really that different. So you couldn't come up with something more absurd than how we're dealing with climate, how we deal with race, everything. So part of it was figuring out how much can I take the ways we were thinking about things away from their original context and have them work. And some of them didn't. Like, I originally wanted to pull this the first impulse to get this off of Earth was to be able to talk about these issues without the same sort of signs that tell people where the book is and way it's thinking about things. Like, for instance, right? Like, I lived in Texas for 12 years. If I heard somebody say the Democrat Party, I knew that they were a Republican that listened to a lot of Fox News and other stuff within a very small ecosystem, right? When I hear, other kind of code words like that, immediately I don't have to hear anything else. I know so much about the way they're thinking. So I wanted to kind of avoid that, and I wanted to take it out further. So being in a totally new culture let me do that. But what I found, honestly, is that you can't distance some of these key things from how our current situation. You can't distance, the effects on a community of kind of out of control capitalism. You can't distance the effects of kind of a white supremacist mindset on the rest of society. Like, they're just too closely entwined. So, but that was interesting for me to figure out too, that, like, I think I'm actually, like, a moderate by constitution. Like, I would love to be somebody who's like both sides. I would love to be somebody who is like, I think if we all sit down together, and that's probably a very liberal impulse on my part to have it. And I resent that I don't live in a period where I can be that way, like, you have no choice. So, like, everybody wants to, there's so many impulses with our news trying to do this both sides, or we live in a time where there's a lot of animosity, or, no, we live, talking about the guns issue, there's a lot of difference in opinion on what gun control should be. And two sides can't come together. But no, it's not two sides. It's one side that has gone deep into nihilism about and building an identity around having and owning guns, right? That's not a two-sided thing, right? So like, this moment does not call for a moderate. So I like, because of it, I've had to kind of, learn to adjust and figure out, being able to say like everything's fine, everything's, both sides is unfortunately intellectually lazy. And like one of the characters in the book does that. And I think one of the reasons I pulled that out at the time was just to like pull that part of myself out so I could spank it, but yeah, and I learned to do that. I figure out later, I'll figure out more about what I learned. I know now, I can look in the distance and say, I learned this one for this book, I learned this one for this book. But I think I'll need more distance than that. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, so then in between Pym and Invisible Things, there's Loving Day. What did you learn from Loving Day? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I learned I never want to write about mixed race stuff ever again. Yeah, I did learn that. Well, you know what? I think Loving Day, like it found a readership, but like I'm still surprised it did. It just wasn't. Well, thank you. Whoever said that. I love you. Thank you very much.
Accurate.
Yes. But I just was thinking I don't know, because sometimes years ago, the first book I did, my editor was the lovely Cameron Rinaldi, who was at Bloomsbury at that time, and The Sopranos had just become a big hit, and she was like, I remember we were talking about it, she's like, I don't understand why anybody other than like me and the kids I grew up with and my family liked this show. So I grew up around these people in North Jersey. I can't figure out why everybody else is so fascinated with them. And so it was kind of that with the mix thing. It was like, it was such a part of my life that I both felt like I had to do the book to slay the ghost, kind of literally in that. But but also it was kind of shock when other people came in to read it. But I never, my understanding of what people want to read has not gotten any better over 25 years.
But I did think the other thing that Loving Day did, it was like since Drop, it was your return to Philly too, and I did feel like it was a love letter to the worst of Philly and the best of Philly.
Well, a lot of people in Philly just read the worst part.
Yeah.
So yeah, I weirdly enough, I just was in Philly before I came up here, and apparently that's a really popular book in my old neighborhood. And my stepmother was visiting my old grade school, volunteering, and while she was volunteering, one of the ladies came out and she had the hardcover, and she's like, "Look, we bought one." It's just like, I probably stole so many books out of that library. This is nice, payback. But yeah, again, I didn't know how people would connect with it. I learned early that I wasn't talented enough to go completely off into space. Unfortunately, that explains
right
so
into
much.
that.
But I knew that I had to give as much as myself as possible, and that basically I had to lay myself up and chop myself up and serve myself raw like sashimi, and by doing that, then there was risk there, and anything interesting is going to take a lot of risk. But the other part of it was that even if it failed, it was something real, So, and I think Loving Day had a lot of those pieces like that, that were things I was too ashamed, honestly, to write about before, because of when I grew up in a time where there really was no mixed race identity, and so much of my early life was proving that I fit in, and so actually acknowledging this thing that I would always just kind of run from. I think it was a good place to be. I mean, Percival Everett used to have this thing in his workshop that he used to do when they ran out of time and he couldn't let the class go too early, or they would get mad at him. So he would have this thing where you write down what you're writing about, write down what's important for you to write about, and then write down what you're afraid of writing about, right? And so everyone does that. And if there's any former student in the house, yeah, that's where I got it from. I got it from Percival. But so when you're done, you look at the thing that you think is important to write about. He was like, well, that's your pretension. Your pretension is saying this is important, right? And you that's bullshit, right? And they say the thing that you're scared about writing about, that's what you should be writing about. Because immediately there's going to be this tension there that the reader are going to read. And I think that was true with Pym too, writing about whiteness, especially as being like a white appearing, mixed African American. So that's, I think, where I'm doing my best work is when I get nervous, you know, and I'm a little uncomfortable. And yeah, and that part I do like about Loving Days. I still feel uncomfortable about the book.
I feel like that's like such a nice way to lead into questions very soon. But also, I know because you started talking with me about it that like your next book is a horror novel, in part.
In part, the next fiction book. Yeah.
The next fiction is a horror novel, and I feel like because you were saying earlier about how do you out satire a time that is so that is outpacing that.
Yeah.
And so then when you said to me like when I knew you were like, oh, I'm working on a horror novel, I was like, oh, okay, that's you zig, right? And it's not just it's a horror novel. It's also, I mean, I don't want to spill your beans.
Yeah, because I'm working on a memoir, but I was working on a memoir of my mom, and then my mom passed while I was working on it, so I had to step away from that and get some distance. I'm just like, it's been a year now, so I'm just at the point where I can really get back in. But to waste time, I just started working on this other book, and the impetus was behind it was writing about something that I immediately feel uncomfortable writing about, and that was writers, because it's such a cliche to write about writers, right? And so like I immediately you're breaking the law by breaking the law of tackiness, you know, by doing that. And so that was the initial impetus behind that. And so I guess it's still a question of like what makes you feel what's a little weird. And like even like telling you guys I'm writing a book about writing is kind of embarrassing, right? Like, it's just, you know. Yeah, and the thing with memoir, it's I have a lot more respect for people who share massive parts of their life with strangers than I did before. I mean, I had a lot before, but like to actually do it is a whole other thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna say like now what I'd like to do is start opening up for questions if there's questions. And what we'll do is if you ask your question, and then just to be safe, I'll repeat your question, presuming I hear it, and then Matt will answer that question. Yes. So
I don't know what you're saying. So yeah.
well, just so that we're sure everybody has heard.
Okay.
Or you could repeat the question.
I can repeat it.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
You repeat it and then you answer it.
Okay, I'll do that.
And I'll take pictures of it.
That's good. Yeah. For the gram.
When it comes to satire, I'm curious about how you know when you are accurately punching down, or if you're punching up, or if you're punching sideways.
Yeah, you never want to punch
Did
down.
everybody hear
right?
that?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, the question is how do you know when you're writing satire if you're punching up or down, or how do you gauge that? Well, the down part is a tricky one because punching up is very like that's just what you do, and you know, punching laterally is okay too because if it's lateral, you're also risking a punch in the mouth, right? When you're punching down is when you have to pull back. So actually, the section that I read, if the circumstance of the novel had proven that guy to be a jackass, I wouldn't have done it. And so partly what it is that it gets you laughing a bit by it, but then hopefully when the situation changes, you realize he's actually right. Then you realize who the joke was on, right? So there's a bunch of moments like that, and I think too like. Just like everybody else's job, you know, period, is also punching down is also about what position of privilege that you sit at and trying to figure out where my privilege is. And, you know, for a lot of things, that's very obvious, but it isn't completely obvious, you know. It does take a lot of consideration and empathy to think about, you know, why am I thinking this thing is funny? You know, what am I laughing at here? Am I laughing at this person because of their pomposity? That's great. Or am I laughing at them because, you know, of their own like mental limitations? That's not, you know. So like, but that's what editing's for. Like I was just watching. I'm a big Sixers fan. I watch all the games. I was watching the finals the other night, and I just remember thinking like, I could never do that because like there's all this pressure. Everyone's watching, and they have to stand up in front of millions of people and perfectly shoot this ball to go in this hoop, right? And I could never do that. Like I would need 30 or 40 attempts, and then I would choose the best one, and then that would be it. And that's what writing is like. So in the editing, when I'm going back over, that's what I'm looking for, that space. Like, does this feel comfortable? And a lot of times stuff gets cut out. A lot of times. And early in my career, I had even less of an idea, and I would come read, and I would see people like the way they react, and like, oh, that part's getting cut, you know, you know. And sometimes it was stuff that I didn't, you know, with Pim, for instance. Pim. It was a snow honkies thing, which to me, like, I thought was just silly and kind of funny, I do feel like I have more license to get away with stuff like that because, my dad's white, half my family is white. And I deal with the world oftentimes as people, perceiving me as white. And I have some of those privileges. So I felt comfortable making fun of that. Whereas, I remember a professor reading it, and she was like, well, are you racist against white people? And so, and I think part of that question was coming out of, who she thought I was, what power she thought I had, what power she thought she had as a white person. So, a lot of times you're just feeling your way through.
A question sort of, you talked about the problem when society starts catching up with your plot midway through the process. But then is that better, or is that, would you rather it happen midway through the creative process? And what happened with Emily St. John Mandel with Station 11 hitting, and then the adaptation hitting right when,
Yeah.
I wonder, is it more worrisome that after you submit to publisher, after they start printing?
That's a really good question. The thing I'm worst at is timing, honestly. And that is something everybody in my life can agree on. I spent a lot of the early part of my career, and the very polite brush off was, oh, you're ahead of your time. Being ahead of your time sucks. Do you know what I mean? If you're a drummer, you don't want to be ahead of your time. You know what I'm saying? And so I think, when you're working on something, one, you have to hope that the art underneath is going to be strong enough to pull it through. But you just, sometimes being a little early is great. Sometimes having it during is great. You just don't know, it's just such a risk. And there are authors who are very good at catching the zeitgeist. I'm just not. I can accept that. So I think honestly, with me, I don't know, whatever timing is going to be is just going to suck anyway. So I don't know. Hopefully, well, I'll call you in 30 years and I'll tell you. I'll figure it out by then.
So you perfectly nail office politics. First of all, you perfectly nail everything in this book.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
And I love.
Thank you, Milda. I really appreciate it.
But the office politics in the spaceship are phenomenal. The box and all of the interaction. I'm just wondering if there was a actual office that you were sourcing that from, or was it more just this is the funniest I can make this spaceship?
No, I can't keep writing about academics, so I have to put them in other jobs. That's what it comes down to. A lot of the behaviors are very. I think it's interesting about academics is there's no boss, right? And because there's no boss, it creates all these different fiefdoms, and boundaries are not just they're implied, so people are constantly trying to shift the boundaries, and so it makes it a really interesting group. But whereas I used to work at Sagat, the restaurant guide, not an interesting place. There was a set boss and editorial assistant, assistant editor, right? It was much more rigid, so there was less craziness. So when I work on stuff like that, I think the urge is not to try and make it funny. The urge is really to reproduce in my head what it actually feels like to work. I just read at Amherst College a couple days ago, and I had never heard this before, but one of the professors there was talking about how all of my books are in part about work and about jobs, and that's something that's just I can't imagine a life that wasn't about work and jobs. Both on an economic level and it's just, I guess it's so close I wouldn't even perceive that. It's just how I see the world. But yeah, so with those jobs, there's just some things like the little cliques and the ways what we call microaggressions now, the bullying, the acceptable modes of bullying, all those seemed really familiar. And I'm also it was really cool to do that have a sociologist do it, so that they could kind of pick it apart what was happening a bit more. But that was the same thing. That didn't happen until later drafts of the book, because it made sense that her observations would be from a socialist, that too, but a sociologist. And but it was similar in Pym. The character in Pym was not a professor until I think the last edits of the book, and that dramatically shot that book forward when that happened. But that's why you have to listen to what direction the book goes into.
We have time for one more. One more, wrap it up. No pressure, it's gotta be an amazing question. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I'm just wondering, it seems like you've lived in really different regions of the country, and I'm curious how that has impacted your writing, and if it impacts the books as you're working on them, or a general kind of worldview, or...
Yeah, I think I'm better at writing about things that are a couple years out, you know? So, like, leaving a place lets you see it better. And so I think I was ready to write about Philly because I hadn't lived there in so long. And, yeah, I think the multiple places does, the benefit of that when you're writing is that it forces you to recognize what is local and what's universal, you know? And I think even like, I can't remember, some Enlightenment philosopher talking about that was the reason for travel, to say all these things you assume are universal truths, and you go to another place and they just are totally different. And so like, in that way it's been really helpful. But I think like a lot of people nowadays, there's the places that I live physically, and then there's the places that my mind lives. And my mind lives also like, or did live on Twitter and lived on Instagram. And, you know, so which was like its own kind of space with its own mores and everything else. So, yeah, I think all those kind of put in, but right now I just feel rootless in that sense. I remember a character once who had traveled so much that he didn't know any languages anymore because they were all blended together in his head. And I'm starting to get that way physically, like feeling like, you know, I think one of the reasons I talk about Philly a lot and write about Philly is because it becomes an anchor in all these other places, you know. But I'm still trying to figure out how that affects things. But getting, like, this is kind of irrelevant, but I was in Philly a couple days ago, and I did not realize how beautiful the city was, because like I would walk down that street, as you know, and I would just see the dog shit and I see like, you know, all the blight. And now I come back and I hear birds that I don't hear in Portland that are amazing because there's like no predator birds around to kill them all. And then I see this architecture that goes back, you know, hundreds of years, beautiful stuff, and spending money on details we just don't spend money on like that anymore. And so like I could not appreciate that when I was there. I looked around and saw a ghetto. Now I go back to the same place, you know, parts of places I grew up, and I see a very, very wealthy area that was going through an economic downturn when I was, you know, growing up. So yeah, I think traveling has been such an important part of figuring out who we are and who I am. So I definitely needed that to do what I do.
All right. On that note, can we have one more round of applause?
Thank you. Also, this man has, thank you, Victor, and he's got a new book called Lone Woman Women that is fantastic. If you get through the first couple pages, it's very scary.
Too,
Round of applause for that. As well as a million other cool things happening. All right, thank you. So there's the next thing.
Thank you guys. Another round of applause for a great conversation. Matt is going to be signing over by where my colleague is standing right now, if you wanted to line up there. And if you wouldn't mind picking up your belongings so we can start to pack up the room, we would really appreciate that. Have a good night.
Thank you. I don't see the off switch.
There's that one.
There's the reason. This is just get some